Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. I would like to thank you for joining us for Artex Academy webinar, Welfare Challenges Ahead. We are excited to have Nigel Cook from the University of Wisconsin-Madison here to speak with us today. Animal welfare is a topic that is very important to Artex. Cow comfort and business sustainability are two of the foundations on which we have built our business. As the industry evolves, our goal is to provide solutions which fit the needs of the farmer, the consumer, and the animal. Just a few quick notes before the presentation begins. We are going to be accepting questions via the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. And also via the chat feature, also at the bottom of your screen. These will be answered at the end of the presentation. And at the end of the presentation, we will also have a quick survey to get your feedback on today's seminar. So I would like to thank Dr. Nigel Cook and Artex Barn Solutions for this educational program. Nigel, it's all yours.
Well, thanks so much. And again, many thanks for the invite from Artex to come and do this with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about welfare challenges currently and with a crystal ball into the future, looking into the future. So hope to keep you entertained for about 50 minutes this lunchtime. So how did we get here? What are the current issues and what are the future issues? We're going to have three components to this talk. Let's start off with the story of how we arrived at this situation where animal welfare really does dominate many of the things and decisions that we make on the dairy farm. Well, I think in the US, it really kicked off with a vengeance with this undercover expose of animal abuse on a slaughter plant in California. This was a video expose performed by HSUS and was remarkably effective at getting some significant changes implemented with regard to the handling of down cows. So that all started in 2008. And I think it's really notable that in the US, 2% of the people produce the food for the rest of the 98, and increasingly fewer and fewer people live in rural communities and are connected to farms. So well-funded, well-organized organizations can have a dramatic impact and feed on the anxieties of those that are somewhat uninformed. Frankly, as an industry, the dairy industry was ill-prepared, and here we are in 2020, and I can say we're still struggling. I work in Wisconsin, and we were not immune to these video exposés. This was one done by Mercy for Animals on a unit in Wisconsin. This was in 2013, highlighting some issues related to poor handling, inappropriate use of hip hoists, dragging cows, and so on. We were unprepared in 2017 around Christmas time when ARM produced these investigations of some pretty high-profile dairies in Florida, uncovering some management and handling issues that, again, were tough to defend. And we were still unprepared last year with what is probably the most talked about expose thus far performed at Fair Oaks Farms. And so we're still struggling with this type of activism and an approach to welfare. If you're a brand name, if you run Starbucks or Taco Bell, you're in the business of brand name protection. These companies simply can't afford to ignore some of these issues on their source farms, and they're driven into action by social media channels, through shareholders, and so on. And so we have a situation in the US, and which is also developing in other parts of the world, currently just getting going in Europe, that activist groups have an anti-ag agenda. I think that's true. And consumers' views can be influenced fairly dramatically by what they hear, by what they read, by what they see, often utilizing social media, boards of directors, propositions, and so on. And these brand names create expectations of their source farms that have to be implemented through the supply chain, through national milk, through co-ops, etc. And you see that in this little diagram here put together by my colleague Jennifer Van Os, just showing you how this change happens. And so that's the situation that we live in. Change can happen, and it can happen extremely quickly. And if you don't believe me, think back to how BST disappeared virtually overnight because one company decided that it didn't want to source BST containing milk. Obviously, no milk contains BST, but that was how it was pitched, that Nestle did not want to have that in its supply chain. And because many of the cheese manufacturers in Wisconsin shipped their whey products to Nestle, then that kicked down the supply chain and BST disappeared virtually overnight. Amazing, enormous power, evoking very rapid change. Another example would be tail docking. The science behind this is not supportive of tail docking, but it really disappeared from our industry despite statements against it by the leading veterinary organizations. It disappeared because the brand names didn't want to be associated with the practice anymore and applied pressure through these mechanisms. Hopefully we can get away from some of this emotive stuff and try to find some common ground. And that really should be that I think everyone's concerned and would value food that is safe and that the food that comes from, the animals, they should be well cared for. I think we can all agree on that statement, and that's helpful to move forward with a discussion about animal welfare that's helpful to our dairy industry. Because I think the focus really shouldn't be on appeasing activists. I think the dairy industry should be able to set a high bar and encourage best practices. That's really what it should all be about. Best practices are good for the producer, and they're good for the cows, and they're good for the consumers. So by addressing these supply chain expectations, we can maintain consumer confidence and stay successful over the long haul, because this topic is not going away despite the dramatic ups and downs of the last few months and the revival of dairy products. Animal welfare is still very high up on the list of topics for discussion related to agriculture. My colleague Jennifer Van Os put this slide together using Meller's definitions for animal welfare. And I think it's useful to just to take a moment and talk about this, because I think as folks that work in the industry, as producers, as veterinarians, nutritionists, we're very comfortable talking about health. We're comfortable talking about nutrition, something I've been very much focused on through my career, and we've got much more comfortable with, and that's in talking about the environment and the impact the environment can have on health and performance. More recently, I think we've been engaged in a conversation about animal behavior. But I think oftentimes it's very difficult for us to have a conversation about mental state, what we call affective experience, which is an incredibly important component of animal welfare, one in which that it's very easy to dismiss if you're very much focused on these issues up here. Mental state can be negative and positive. It can be related to pain and fear and panic, but it can also be very positive: comfort, contentment, calm. And these aspects of animal welfare to consumers and to people that are passionate about animal welfare are just as important, or sometimes even more important, than the issues that we are generally more accustomed to talking about. The response of the industry to concerns of animal welfare has been through auditing. In the US, the most common program we've been exposed to is the Dairy Farm Program, Farmers Assuring Responsible Management. In Canada, north of the border, it's pro-action. And depending on where you are in the world, there are programs related to private companies. The Red Tractor program is a UK program. Welfare Quality is a European-based program. So depending on where you are in the world, there are different auditing programs, but ultimately they all try to achieve the same purpose, and that is to give consumers some confidence that the industry's looking at itself and someone's taking a watchful eye to make sure that the animals are well cared for. So audits, assessments, assurance programs, whatever you want to call them, are a response of the industry to provide this degree of oversight to the dairy industry. And frustrating though that may be to many dairy producers who just want to be left alone, and I completely understand it, the bad news is it's not going away. This new normal is not going to change. Oversight is here to stay. And the opportunity for those involved in the industry then is that every dairy farm, no matter the size or shape, will have to demonstrate compliance with animal health and welfare standards. And this creates an ideal opportunity to drive the industry forward. I just put this slide up as an example of the introduction of Dairy Farm. And guess what? It was in 2009, the very next year after that California video expose. So that was the response of the industry back then. It was a voluntary participation program. Can you remember those days? Well, very soon, this program's revised every 3 years. It became a mandatory program. It started to develop some teeth. There was a phase-out plan for tail docking that was very rapidly changed. You can see that it became mandatory much earlier than 2022 in version 3, which inserted greater accountability and some terminology, MCAPs and CCPs, and I'll talk about those in a moment. Version 4 is just released for 2020, increased accountability, immediate actions, shortened timelines, and implementations of increased oversight are characteristic of the 4th version. Can you imagine launching version 4 way back in 2009 on an unsuspected dairy industry? We've kind of become used to it, haven't we? Proaction follows a fairly similar kind of evolution. Proaction covers more than animal welfare, but uses very similar terms. These mandatory corrective action plans are very significant things such as the VCPR, herd health plans, tail docking, animal handling and care, the cow care agreement, water access, and so on. You only have 9 months to fix some of these issues if they turn up on the MCAP list. And then there's a list of things that we call continuous improvement plans, or CIPs. You have a longer duration to fix these issues, 3 years or less, depending on the co-op, but 3 years is generally the visit cycle of the farm program. And these are things like lameness and injury scoring, body condition, pain management, and so on. So in version 4, we're starting to see more teeth, 60-day conditional certifications, conditional decertifications, and if we don't comply, an inability to sell milk. I do want to highlight, though, with all of these audit programs, is that they don't fix problems, they identify them. You have an audit, somebody says you've got a lot of lame cows or cows with sore hocks. The audit itself doesn't fix that issue. The farmer's left to fix the issue after the auditor's left the farm. And that creates an opportunity for all of us that work with our dairy farmers to help them solve these issues. So let's talk about some of the current issues as they relate to dairy farming. I think top of the list most recently is pain management. We've seen some videos related to dehorning calves without local anesthetic. Now it's become a standard within Proaction and is on the way to being that in the dairy farm program, with certain companies requiring pain management for painful practices such as disbudding and dehorning. Animal handling, I think if you watch any activist video, is really high on the list of concerns. And if you spend any time around a milking parlor and watch that crowd gate and the negative effect it has on some of the cows when it's misused, you can tell that this is a pretty common issue on many of our farms. Spending the time to train milkers how to use movement principles to load cows in the parlor is incredibly useful. It's incredibly time well spent. I used to go to parlors and do timings and test vacuums. I'd rather spend a few minutes just showing milkers like this one how to load the cows into the parlor appropriately. You can see he walks in the opposite direction, close to the cows. They move past them. He applies pressure. They make that movement. There's no hand waving, no shouting, no sticks. And then when he moves in the same direction of the cows, he does so as far away as possible from the cows. This guy's going to get his 10,000 steps on his Fitbit, no problem at all. We can also design better facilities on our farms, and this is a great example of a bud box design used to load cows into a trim chute. Carl Berge here from Comfort Hoof Care has got his 4 cows in the bud box, and look where he stands and how he applies pressure. Just turns the cows, because the cows like to go back from whence they came, and it's easy for us to just gently turn them around, and they're fairly willing just then to just go back and go, okay, you want me to go here? No problem. We can make things a lot less stressful and a lot easier to on the eye if you're an activist by providing the right facilities. Lameness, if anybody knows me, I've spent quite a long time trying to reduce lameness problems on farms. Dairy Farm allows for 5% severely lame cows right now. That's 5 in 100, which sounds maybe okay. 50 in 1,000 doesn't sound that good to me. But severely lame cows are a failure of both prevention and treatment. And for that, we need to hold the herd accountable. Similarly, we're scoring injuries, principally of the hock and the knee, and so we'll allow 5% in dairy farm swollen and abraded hocks. And again, that feels a little too high on a large dairy, but that's where we are. And we struggle with hock injuries. Hock injuries are far more common than we'd like to see. I look at them in their most severe form with swellings and ulceration, like you see here, as lesions that are akin to bed sores. They're pressure lesions, often related to cows that are lame. First, you see this cow has a block on her foot there. Lame cows rest in one position for a prolonged amount of time. That pressure builds up and we get necrosis and tissue breakdown of the tissue over those bony prominences. And we've got good data to show that lame cows are more at risk of developing severe hock injuries later on. So part of managing hock injuries is to manage lameness. But we also know deep bedding, especially deep bedding sand, decreases hock injuries while maintaining that bedding and increasing the resting length of the bedded surface, and then decreasing the housing period duration are all factors involved in helping producers reduce the risk for hock injury. And we find that in our own data. These are data from Wisconsin dairies where deep bedding in the yellow relative to mattresses in the red shows a significant decrease in lameness, a very significant decrease in overall hock injuries, and a little bit of a difference in knee injuries as well. Neck injuries are also being audited, most commonly in this location here, related to usually a feed rail that's located too low or too close to where the cows are standing. Setting it higher and further forward can relieve this pressure. Back injuries are often farm specific in terms of perhaps some stall design component or a component of the farm, the parlor design or another aspect of the farm will cause these back related injuries. And then we have broken tails, and broken tails are generally not related to facility design, but they're heavily related to animal handling. And I'm working on one animal welfare audit that really uses broken tails as a measure of low stress handling and an indicator that someone is being a little too aggressive in somewhere in the parlor or in the breeding management, and it's an indicator of good stockmanship to reduce the number of broken tails down to very low levels. So that's what we're dealing with currently, and you see that reflected within pro-action audits, within dairy farm audits. But what about the future issues? And for the remainder of the talk, I would like to focus on some of those future aspects to think a little bit of a crystal ball to discuss what we might have to do as we move forward. Because, and that's not to say that we're going to these things will come to fruition, but they are things that are being talked about fairly heavily within the industry, and things that have come up within discussions of changes to dairy farm already. But it's a crystal ball. It's a guess. Again, I'm not holding and saying that these things will definitely come to pass, but it's worth thinking about them because of the risk it plays to how we design and lay out facilities and how we manage cows right now. So let's come back to this slide from Jennifer talking about animal welfare not being just good health. It is about these positive experiences that impact the affective state. So welfare experience of the animal can be poor, and many of the assurance programs and welfare audit programs that we've seen out there have been very much related to minimizing poor welfare. That's the basis of the 5 freedoms: freedom from pain, injury, and disease, freedom from thirst and hunger. But that's, only one part of the discussion of welfare state. Another part of it is the positive experiences, the good welfare, the calmness, the contentment, and the positiveness that we can create. That is really important to start to consider. And as I work with different groups on devising animal welfare programs into the future, more emphasis will be placed on emphasizing quality of life and good welfare, not just trying to minimize the bad stuff, which is clearly bad. And consumers just have an expectation that this simply won't happen on a farm. So part of that topic, if you're north of the border, where we see a lot of tie stall based farms, is this restriction of movement that comes with tie stall housing. This is a relatively new construction tie stall. We don't see too many of those in the US, although there are some around the Pennsylvania area. I can think of only less than a handful of new tie stall facilities that I've been involved in Wisconsin the last 20 years. But in the US, 39% of US dairy farms are housed in tie stalls in our last survey. It's likely less now, but it's still a pretty significant number of farms. And as you look at cows in tie stalls, and this would be an older tie stall we visited in Wisconsin, you can clearly see that there are some issues with this. Often the platform is small, the stalls are narrow. Here you see the tie rail is low, the chain short, and this cow's really struggling to lie in that closed sleep position that they really love to lie in. A minimal chain or even a stanchion, if we're using that, would completely preclude or make this rather difficult for the cow to get into. Again, that gets back to these positive experiences. Sleep is important to cows. They don't sleep very long, probably less than an hour a day, but it's important that they are able to sleep. And when we house cattle in these kinds of conditions, it's very difficult for them to do that. So as you look at tie stall housing, A lot of it is old, it follows older recommendations, and it's compromised in many ways. And I can understand that there will be in the future increased scrutiny and an expectation for higher standards of comfort and care in these facilities. We're still largely in dairy farm, focused on animal outcomes. We've argued that over the last year or so with when concerns about tie stalls have been talked about. But freedom of movement is a sticking point because we're still limiting the cow's ability to move around. We can certainly build better tie stalls, and Neil Anderson devoted a big chunk of the latter part of his career on developing standards through OMAF that we have embraced within the Dairyland Initiative and elsewhere, with higher head rails, longer chains, easy access to water, lower feed curbs, a raised manger, and larger stall dimensions to provide that cow with an increased, more comfortable surface to lie down on. What's disappointing is more than 10 years after these guidelines were developed, the relatively few farms that have adopted those, and I'm just looking at a review of this most recently, still disappointed in the relative adoption rate of these enhancements. So we can make the stall more comfortable, we can reduce the risk for lameness and injury and so on, but the animal is still restricted. So we still don't get around the restriction of movement discussion. These new recommendations, there have been a number of surveys, predominantly done in Canada again, where we've seen these new stalls built. We've looked at the impact of longer neck chains, higher tie rails, more space behind the head rail, increased platform length and width, and use of cow trainers on the risks for hock and knee injuries, neck lesions, udder hygiene, risk for lameness and line time. And as you can see across here, most of the arrows go in the right direction. Some do not. And between studies, there's some disagreement sometimes as well. But for the most part, these changes have been very positive impacts on the animal welfare and overall welfare outcomes. It's a pity, again, that adoption rate has been relatively low. But ultimately, I think if tie stalls are continuing into the future, we have to have some period, daily period, of untethered exercise where the cows are allowed outside the barn. And it's common for many of our tie stalls in the US to do this. In recent survey, about 75% of tie stalls allowed some type of outdoor access when the weather allowed. I think it's probably going to be in the region of 2 to 6 hours a day. There's some nice social data from UBC on what consumers would find enough, and it points more towards 6 hours a day than it does 2. But if we're going to do that for tie stalls, and we've argued this with tie stall task forces looking at these issues, is okay, if we create these standards and expectations for tie stall owners, what about free stalls? Well, cows are free to move around the barn, but they're still within the barn. Will their freedom become under some scrutiny? And definitely in Europe, that is the case. There is an expectation in Europe that dairy cattle are allowed outside, and grazing is a component of the management system. That's not the case currently in the US, but it is in certain parts of the world. This gets back to an argument of talking about natural behavior versus natural living. Is it a requirement for us to put the cow in a natural state out at pasture? Or can we build a facility where we can mimic many of the behaviors and evoke an argument that focuses on natural behavior versus that naturalness of the environment? Because I'd question whether a natural state is really a better state. Sometime. This is a mob of New Zealand cows all munching grass at pasture. a pretty beautiful sight to behold there. Just sit in the field and listen to them for 20-30 minutes. It's a great way to pass an afternoon. But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes in a Wisconsin summer, there's not much grass left. The heat stress drives cows to bunch. There's flies. And when one cow decides it's thirsty, then everybody else is going to work out how to all crowd around this water trough. And that's if there's water at pasture, as is the case here. In many situations, there may not be. When we ask the cow what she thinks, we get an interesting answer, and this has been repeated multiple times. This was one of the first studies done in 2009, again in British Columbia, looking at what cows do when you allow them access to a freestall, pretty nice sand-bedded freestall, and at the same time allow them access to pasture. Well, those fickle cows, they choose both. They kind of like to be inside the barn during the day and then outside at pasture during the night. You can see the nighttime hours, the cows are kind of out there enjoying themselves. So they don't all go running for the door. They utilize these environments in different ways. And there's a growing amount of data that there is a benefit of planned pasture access even within these housing facilities. And so I've challenged Dairymen over the last few years to try to develop systems where some of the cows are outside for some of the time. And that's not muddy paddock with, in pouring rain. This is allowing the cows outside when the weather's good, when there's a little bit of green on the surface there. And so we don't increase the risk for heel warts and other issues by doing this practice. It's a positive practice, not a negative one. Most grazing herds, however, still house cattle, and so it doesn't absolve us of creating an ideal housing environment. So for part of the year, most grazing herds are going to need a facility to put the cows in, and it's on us to make sure that that facility promotes health and decreases the risk for injury and maximizes longevity and animal welfare. I've spent much of my career trying to make sure that that's the case. There's various components of cow comfort. Shelter from climate extremes is one component. Allowing cows freedom of access to feed and water is another. Allowing them to be able to walk and exercise. But most of the time when we think about cow comfort, we really focus on optimizing resting behavior. And that's making sure that the cow lies down sufficiently with an appropriate number of lying bouts of reasonable duration. Within that resting behavior, the cow spends a little bit of that time sleeping. So when those issues are impacted, such as during heat stress, for example, we compromise animal welfare. Heat stress is a growing concern. We've had a really hot summer this summer. The cows have coped with it extraordinarily well because we've got smarter about how to deal with it. But heat stress does impact the biological functioning of the animal, its production and fertility. It impacts its ability for natural living. If you go into a barn and all the cows are all bunched together, you know what I mean. And it impacts their affective state. There's frustration, perhaps aggression, hunger and thirst, and so on. Switching over to calves, we have developed a system where 90+% of our wet calves are housed in individual pens. We've done it to control feed intake, and we've done it because we can keep a close eye on the calf. We haven't done it to promote good welfare, and we've kind of omitted the focus on the behavior of the animal. And I think that's been a mistake, because I believe within the next few years, we're going to switch as an industry from individual housing to paired or group housing being a standard. We've seen this shift already in many farms related to automated feeding. We see these group housing systems being constructed with automated milk feeding systems very successful when managed correctly, and the facilities are built appropriately. But commonly, we're now seeing, when we turn up on our farms, not one calf in a pen, but two. And I think pair raising will really take over as the standard of practice for our industry, solely because it's very easy to adapt our current system to take out a middle panel and allow two calves to group together. Why should we do that? Well, if you look at the literature, it's overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming, that there are positive effects of social housing on calf performance and animal welfare. Dry matter intake of solid feed, final body weight, average daily gain, all things the producer cares about, all either positive or no effect, but not negative when we social house. So we are getting a positive here from not only a performance perspective, but an animal welfare perspective, because those calves, when they're grouped together, develop better, they become less skittish, and it promotes, they're a little smarter and better able to deal with surprising circumstances. So there are some challenges along the way, the concerns over cross-sucking and navel problems, unequal growth rates and so on. All of them, we've proven, are not insurmountable. We can make changes to the feeding management. We can use modifications to the way we feed, to the teats that we use, and decrease the risk of these negative impacts and reap the rewards of the positive ones. And Jennifer Van Os has just completed a study showing how you do this in something that a large proportion of our industry already has, and that is hutches. Just simply joining hutches together, pair raising them within this system can be done very successfully. We've done it at our own UW Arlington facility for the last year. Yes, they do huddle in the same hutch, and there are hutch designs now that are bigger, that give them the same space, that allow the cows to live together, and they kind of like that. Do they compete for food? Yep, you'll often get a calf trying to muscle in on the other one. You have to be a little conscious of that. But again, feeding management, teat choice, and so on, we can make these changes and make this a very positive experience for not only the calves, but the producer as well. A discussion we had this time round with Dairy Farm 4 was the provision of a soft bedding surface for calves on milk. I think it's extremely important. I do not believe these grates are an acceptable surface for a calf on milk, yet we see large facilities being constructed right now with this type of flooring and management. Nothing happening right now in the auditing circles, but again, it was discussed. There are some pretty strong views on this and some data being developed. It may well come up for discussion again in the next time around. One of the biggest issues that we, I think, as an industry have to face is cow-calf separation over the next few years. This is one that really goes against the industry's view that if we just tell consumers and if we inform them about what we do, everything will be okay. This is a case that when we inform consumers that we take calves away from their mothers at birth, we don't get away with that. They do not like it, and it is a challenge for our industry to think about how we manage the cow and the calf at the point of calving in a different manner. We do it for very positive reasons, maternal bonds and so on, health, colostrum delivery, prevention of Mycobacterium pseudotuberculosis. All these things are very admirable, but we really haven't done sufficient studies to really explore the maternal bond as it is right now in a modern Holstein cow, high-producing cow, and the positive aspects of keeping the calf with the mother for longer. And by longer, I'm not sure what that is. Is it 2 days? Is it 7 days? Is it a month? I don't know what that is, but there's going to be a need for science to help us address this issue moving forward. When you look at how we currently manage cows at the point of calving, I'm going to state that I don't think we have a great system right now. After calving, in our survey of high-producing herds in Wisconsin, only 7% of herds have a dedicated colostrum pen for residue risk fresh cows to go to. 30% of herds move those fresh cows directly into a sick pen where they mix with already sick animals, potentially with mastitis, salmonella, or something else. And the remainder move those residue risk cows directly into the fresh pen, which about 93% of our herds operate. So now we have residue risk cows mixed with non-residue risk cows in the same group. I don't think we've got it worked out right now. So I'm not going to put up a barrier and say we simply can't deal with keeping the calf together with the mother in some form for a prolonged period. Maybe it's a way of keeping a small creche area adjacent to the fresh pen where we have a mixing area where the calves can be let into, the cows can be put into, and then we separate them again for the majority of the day to allow feedings. There's got to be a way to do this. We're going to have to work on it over the next 3 to 5 years. And it's already happening in parts of Europe, and this is just Googling cows and calves together. So I'm not going to say anything here should be something that we repeat on a dairy in the US. So certainly suckling cows in free stalls doesn't really excite me very much, but a means to keep the cow and calf safe, but together for a prolonged period will be needed as we move forward in this industry. Sometimes it's surprising what consumers react very positively to. We were doing an Associated Press piece a few years back, looking at the Dairyland Initiative and what we'd done to improve cow comfort and cooling and so on. And I can remember the videographer taking this video of this cow just enjoying her time on this brush. And it became part of this material that we produced, and one of the things was taken up by HuffPost. And you can see down here 1.4 million views. I made the mistake of reading the comments, 2,000 of them. Never do that, never do that. But they were interesting because these HuffPost readers, they're obviously have a certain lean towards a certain direction, but they really couldn't create a negative story about this cow enjoying this brush that this dairy farmer had purchased them. So sometimes it's tremendously positive for everyone. And again, from Jennifer's work, she's been looking at cow brushes and brushes for using with calves as well and young stock. I think it's a grand opportunity to reframe the discussion beyond just health. The farmer is going to give the cow a brush that helps with health, but the cows kind of like them. They just enjoy using them, and that impacts their behavior and their feelings and so on. And so we create a very positive animal experience out of the simple application of a brush. And importantly, in cow behavior studies, cows will work to get access to these things almost as much as they will to fresh total mixed ration. So almost as much to access food as to get to one of these brushes. They enjoy it, and every farm should have one. So that is a discussion of our current welfare issues, and hopefully some things that I see looming in the future. Not again that address issues that we have to address immediately, but things that we do have to think about and do have to start thinking of ways we can challenge our current practices and perhaps improve them going into the future. Because what we're talking about is getting into the continuous improvement business and out of the excuse business. This plays extremely well with consumers. The thought that someone can look at our farms and that our dairy producers can say, yep, this is where we are now, but I can make these changes and modifications and I can be in a better place in the future. I can make things just a little bit better for the next time when someone comes and audits my farm, rather than the dairy producer or their consultants just saying, well, this is how it is, and making excuses. I want to thank our sponsors, and Artex has been a major supporter of our workshops over the last few years. Saputo, our premier sponsor, and I'll direct you to our website, the dairylandinitiative.vetmed.wisc.edu, where you can get more answers to your questions. But with that, I'd be happy to take questions either online or in person and try to answer them for you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nigel. We have a couple of questions here for you, and anyone else who has questions, please feel free to send them via the question and answer portion at the bottom of your screen. So the first question is, regarding hock lesions, do you have any recommendations for small dairies with mattresses to provide more bedding or prevent hock lesions, as many don't currently have the money to convert to sand?
Yeah, it's a challenge. It really is. We've got a lot of older tie stall facilities with thin rubber mats or rubber mattresses, and the data is clear. A softer surface, more bedding reduces the risk for hock injury. So, three things to deal with: reduce lameness. So make sure that the cows are able to get up and down easily, so they're not spending prolonged periods of time lying on one side. So all the things that go into that: good hoof care, foot bath programs, and so on. Provide as much bedding as you can. Sometimes we'll add a bedding retainer on the back of these platforms. It does increase work, but you really can't have more bedding unless you put some type of retainer on the back of the curb. In tie stalls, does depend on your milk inspection. Sometimes we'll use a rubberized timber that we can get from Menards and other home or good stores, or a PVC pipe we used to use, or a fiberglass pipe as a retainer. So that will help. And then the other thing you actually see in the picture that I've put up here, get the cows out of the barn. So if that barn is compromised, getting them to rest outside on a pasture area will help reduce the severity of the lesions.
Thank you. As we continue with the questions, I'm going to launch the polling for you to tell us how we did with this seminar. So the second question is, the industry is moving towards robotic milking. How do you see it from an animal welfare perspective?
There's tremendous positives with AMS units, and then there's some negatives. There's this narrative that cows are free to roam around and do as they please. That's true for some cows. It's not true for all cows. There is still competition, particularly competition to access the robot, especially for first lactation heifers that we need to manage. But many of the things that we've learned from conventional units in terms of cow comfort, ventilation, surface, loop design, and so on, are immediately applicable to robotics. And I see issues where we ignore those things for the sake of, well, we can't have scrapers, or we can't manually scrape the alleys, so we're going to have slatted floors, and if we have slatted floors, we can't have deep bedding, so we'll put mattresses in. Well, that to me is just going backwards. Those are lame excuses, and they'll create lame cows. So the things that we've learned that are positive for conventional herds, apply them to AMS units. Managing access, making sure that we have good gating and throughput and movement of cows around the robots to limit competition between younger and older animals. Those are the key things that I see emerging.
The next question, you discussed cows being tethered. Some regions have that practice for calves. What are your comments on this practice?
Similar issues would apply. There'd be concerns for adult cattle being tethered. Those concerns are equal for calves. It's still restriction of movement, and it's something that I think as an industry we'll move away from eventually.
And then OMAFRA in Ontario stopped recommending the construction of new tie stall barns recently, but continues to encourage the improvement of existing facilities. Can you see tie stalls phasing out over in the US over the next 10 years?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've had a lot of heated discussions about tie stalls over the last few years. They're still being built on the East Coast in Pennsylvania. We don't see many new constructions in the upper Midwest. So I do see them being ultimately phased out, but certainly in the US and parts of Canada, there's obviously a religious plain sect component to this, in that many Amish, Mennonite, and Hutterite farms are housing cows in tie stalls, and so we have to have a phase out. It can't be an abrupt change. But yeah, I see countries around the world, most of the Northern European countries have phased out tie stalls already. I think we won't see too many new ones being built into the future.
Is there anywhere that you can get new tie stall requirements?
The new tie stall requirements are the same as the ones that Neil and Harold House and those guys put together. So the OMAFRA website, I think, is still up there, so they're available. And if you go to the Dairyland Initiative, we have a full tie stall section to tell you how to do it, or hopefully how to remodel it, would be more accurate right there.
And what is your feeling on compost pack barns?
Composting, the pack style barns were really common in the upper Midwest, largely in Minnesota, about 10, 15 years ago. A great, easy way for someone to transition out of a 60 cow tie stall, an older facility, into a comfortable unit. But what we learned over the ensuing years is that they're really tough to manage. They're expensive to run. You need a good, cheap supply of organic bedding, otherwise the bedding costs are going to be horrific. And many of the facilities, at least we saw in Wisconsin, were changed over to free stalls ultimately. So I think they have their place. They're a good, low cost, very comfortable option for smaller units to transition out of uncomfortable older tie stall stanchion facilities. I don't see us building massive new units with composting. We may see something like the Saudi barns in hot, dry climates, where you just basically put up a roof and use manure solids as your bedding material in a kind of lot type system. I'm working with some folks in Australia where compost barns have some interest, again, because they're generally low cost to build, but they're not low cost to maintain.
Is there a trend, a trend like in Europe against the building of mega farms in the Netherlands? And can very large farms ever offer outdoor access?
So there's certainly an anti-large farm in large parts of Europe, not all parts, but many parts of Europe. Very difficult to get a 1,000 cow facility built in the UK, where I'm from. Many of the larger units have basically got multiple farms to make up those numbers. If the question is that same movement happening in the US, there is a movement. There are certainly folks that are concerned about large farms, but I still see large farms being constructed and will continue to do so. I do think we may have kind of gone over the top in terms of these 10, 20,000 cow facilities. Major issues with the distance the cows are walking, the time out of the pen, and optimizing production in that in facilities that are that huge. But personally, a cow comfort person, animal welfare person like me, I'm pretty happy seeing 1,500, 2,000 cow facilities. I think I can build and design those extremely well and look after the cows in them and have a a viable operation. We've certainly seen farms up to 5,000 cows where that's the case. Depends on management. But yeah, there's certainly a growing movement towards the sort of mega dairy type approach, but they're still going to be built.
For cow and calf separation, will consumers accept nurse cows, or does it need to be the mother and that protecting the maternal bond from being broken?
Who knows? Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. Is, you know, there's concern, but how do we solve it? If the concern is that they want the calf to be with its mother for a prolonged period of time, then the answer would be simple. They would not accept that as a solution. So I think we have to find a way to keep the calf within close proximity of its mother and have some access to her at managed times of the day to get through this. But it's an interesting question.
How do we balance offering pasture access with CAFO and environmental regulations?
You know, there's certainly CAFO regulations and parts of Wisconsin where we've actually had to build barns to house cows because they're not allowed to graze, and there are many parts of the US where those regulations preclude outside access. So that's the argument that we're always having. Particularly with animal activism and consumer concern, is that, well, we'd love to have this, but you know, it's not practical, or we can't do that here. And so I would fight any enforced mandate that required all cows on all farms to have to graze. But I will challenge people that when they can do it, if you look at the larger farms out west, they all have outside lots where cows can go out of the barn and exercise, not pasture. They're more of a dry lot system, and there is outdoor access built into those, even in large farms. And so it can be done, and I challenge everybody to try and find a way to do that, to build that into their systems into the future.
That looks to be the last of our questions, so thank you very much. It's been a pleasure having you again, Nigel. I'd like to end off inviting you to join our next webinar on August 28th, where we're talking about designing calf barn ventilation. You can find out more on our website, or you can shoot us an email at marketing@artexbarn.com, and we'll be happy to answer your questions. So thank you everybody for joining us, and once again, thank you very much, Nigel.
Thanks everyone for joining me.